All right. Hello and welcome to our Town branch of the Carroll County Public Library. I am excited to welcome back a former Carroll County Public Library employee and a debut author, Elaine Meyers. Elaine served as a children's librarian, storyteller, puppeteer, and administrator at Carroll County Public Library from 1974 to 1978, and she is also credited as having created the programming department at CCPL. She is the very embodiment of the library's tagline, Infinite Possibilities. While working in libraries here in Maryland and later in Phoenix, Arizona, Elaine continually sought out books about orphanages and the way they treat orphans. As she did, she realized that the story of her mother, the story of an orphan and her three sisters who lifted themselves from Appalachian poverty to college education, wasn't one that she could find on any bookshelves. Feeling the story needed to be told, she decided to write it herself. Her book, Iron Pants, is a fictionalized account of her mother's life. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce author Elaine Meyers to speak about her writing process and Iron Pants.
Well, as you all know, I'm home. This is where it all began. And as you can see in the slide, the power of place, finding the narrative. How do you begin to write a book, and how do you even think you need to write a book? Anyone who works in a library understands that there are more high-quality books than we will ever be able to read. I never thought I needed to write one. And then Ann Tyler said, I sit down, and Tyler says, I sit down and wonder if there's anything I have to say that's worth the life of a tree. So Finksburg knows the answer to that. No. So already I am thinking I will never do this. But as was so eloquent in the introduction, what happened is no one was telling the story of my mother and her sisters. No one was telling the story of how you could go to an orphanage that was state of the art and still is state of the art. So I sat down to write, and we're going to talk about the research, the writing process. We're going to have questions and answers, and we're going to start with the power of place. And I don't know if you've had a chance to see Carroll County, the book, but chapter 1 begins, chapter 1, Orphans, Carroll County, Maryland, May 1986. Now, where would we be having lunch and ice cream in Carroll County, Maryland? Yell it out. Loggers, of course. This is a logger story. Okay. And my friend Susie's here. Give a wave. Okay. Carroll County, Maryland. Today, my friend Susie and I had lunch with her mother-in-law, Mrs. Scott. And I was surprised when Mrs. Scott, who hardly ever spoke, told this story. When Jeffrey was just 2 years old, Mr. Scott and I brought him to this very restaurant for an ice cream. Jeffrey was such a verbal child. He ate his ice cream and recited the name of every flavor he knew: chocolate, strawberry, vanilla, mint, sherbet. After we finished, we waited in line to pay our bill. Jeffrey pointed to a jar filled with coins and dollar bills that sat on the desk near the register. "Whose money?" he asked. I always wanted to encourage Jeffrey's interest in words. I pointed to the sign next to the jar and read, "Please help our church serve the orphans in foreign lands. Any contribution will help." Jeffrey looked at me. "What is an orphan?" An orphan is someone whose mother and father have died. Jeffrey's eyes got wide. His face twisted in surprise, changed to horror, and then grief. He began to cry and then wail. He put his head on my shoulder and would not let go of me. He cried for almost an hour. Mrs. Scott ended her story. Who would believe that a 2-year-old could understand the meaning of being an orphan? Who would think that one so young could understand the bond between mother, father, and child? Let my mother's story begin. All of you who know Jeffrey Scott know he's still very verbal and wonderful. And that's how our story began. And the other thing I have to tell you about starting here in Carroll County was we began with Martha McCoskey, who said, you can do anything that doesn't cost money. Whoa, we're there. And so Susie and I started puppetry. We started storytelling. We had, thank you, dear. That was a disaster waiting to happen. We did anything that didn't cost money. We had very good friends like Walt Michael that I went to school with at Western Maryland for 1.5 years, but also high school that taught us Dulcimer. And so we were in the kind of environment that everyone in this room is still in. Carroll County is a special place that lets you become who you are and lets even someone who is a reticent storyteller like Mrs. Scott share a story that probably says all you have to say about being an orphan. So with the storytelling, we've been talking about ghosts and legends of Carroll County and how we started that because the middle school students said, hey, I don't want anything but ghost stories. You got it? And we said, okay. So we saw Jesse and worked with Shirley Libby to put the book together and all that stuff. It was wonderful, and I'm delighted to know that we're still screaming and yelling and howling for Ghosts and Legends in October still. How did this begin? Okay, so I wasn't going to write a book. I had that Ann Tyler thing. I have to take care of cheese. I'm not going to do this. And then my mother and I went to Boone, North Carolina. What is very interesting about my mother is that, like my father, who was in World War II, and any of us who had grandparents or parents in World War II, they didn't tell you anything about what happened in the war. 0, nothing. It was over, and we're starting, 1946, the baby boom. Here we go. Okay. And mother never talked about the orphanage, even though the experience was a good one. I often wondered about that, and I go back to 2-year-old Jeffrey saying, no one wants to visit the place where you don't have a mother and father. You don't want to go there. So when mother and I went to Boone, North Carolina, it was in 1986. It was my 40th birthday and her 76th birthday, and 74th birthday. And we're going to learn about Josephine in North Carolina. It's going to be great. So we drive to Boone, North Carolina, and we're driving, and we come up a hill. There's a big boulder that says, Boone, North Carolina, 3,000 feet. I've been driving, and then the road curves, and there's another big rock that says, Boone, North Carolina, 3,000 feet. And my mother looks at me, and every time you went south of the Mason-Dixon line, her voice changed. And so she looked at me and she said, honey, they moved the town. And I said, Mother, I don't think they moved the town. Let's just get out, park the car, and find it. Now, when Mother, one of the things that happened with the Appalachian, with the Thomasville Baptist Orphanage, which is the real name of the orphanage Mother and her sisters went to, was they had networks. So Mother, when it was time for her to go to college, had a family that they set her up with. She lived with the family. She took care of the older mother, so she had room and board and was able to cut down college loans and so forth. So she said, now that's the Coffey's family. That's where they live. And I said, well, let's go knock on the door. She says, well, honey, you just don't go knock on the door. You know what? And I said, yeah, if you're in the South, you don't do that. If you're in the North, you just walk up and knock on the door. Knock on the door, and out come the Coffey sisters, surrounding mother with love and hugs like she's a missing relative. And this is the beginning of the story. When I looked at what was going on in my mother's past in Boone, I realized there was family and there was love in a way that she didn't talk about, but it was right before my eyes. The other thing, as we looked in the trip to Boone, we found I.G. Greer and his wife, who were the teachers when mother was there. And also he became the superintendent. And if you know anything about folk music, you will find I.G. Greer. And I.G. Greer collected ballads. So this is mother's friend that she met and knew from the orphanage. Collected over 300 ballads. At the age of 14, I.G. could sing more than 40 ballads. And he used to quote Alan Lomax, who said, "The common man, the individual, is everything in American folk song." It's true. And the Dulcimer and music became a very, very important part of the story because of this trip to Boone. I'm still not writing the book, have you noticed? No. Oh, I would like to read to you in honor of my friend, the Dulcimer man, a Dulcimer comfort. And this begins when a Miss Coffey is coming to stay with the orphan girls and before the farm is sold. So there are 4 girls, their parents have died, and they're in Warren County, dirt poor farm, and Miss Coffey comes. Betty is the oldest sister. Pamela is the second sister, my mother's the third, and Nora Ann is the baby. Warren County, North Carolina, spring 1918. Betty was up early and began the day fussing. "We must make a good impression on Miss Coffey. Here are your clean clothes." The more Betty barked orders, the slower Josephine and Pamela moved. Betty was buttoning Nora Ann's dress while Pamela and Josephine looked for their socks. Betty froze at the sound of a wagon coming up the lane. "Hurry up! What will Reverend Miller and Miss Coffey think if we have uncombed hair?" scolded Betty. Nora Ann squirmed as Betty attempted to comb the tangles out of her hair. Josephine put on her socks and shoes. Betty tossed her the hairbrush. Josephine ran the brush through her hair, threw it to Pamela. Pamela managed to brush her hair and pull on her shoes at the same time. The sound of voices on the porch made the sisters stand up straight as Pamela tucked the hairbrush under a pillow. Betty called, "Come in. The door is open." As Miss Coffey entered the cabin, Josephine again wondered why anyone would want to live in the hills with 4 heartbroken sisters. She studied Miss Coffey carefully. Miss Coffey was tall and slender with dark brown hair tied back in a braid, fastened with an old-fashioned ivory haircut. Her dress was dark blue and nicely fitted at her thin waist. The dress looked old, but not too worn. Josephine wondered if she had a hat or coat. Her shy smile and dark brown eyes calmed Josephine. Reverend Miller followed Miss Coffey, carrying her hat, coat, a worn suitcase, and old-fashioned Dulcimer. He placed the suitcase on the floor and stood beside Miss Coffey. Betty introduced herself and shook Miss Coffey's hand. Pamela and Nora Ann did the same. "How long will you be staying with us?" Josephine asked as she shook hands. I will stay for the funeral and until you find a new home. Why did you come to stay with us? Josephine continued. Reverend Miller glanced at Miss Coffey, while Betty just frowned and shook her head. Miss Coffey met Josephine's gaze and smiled. You ask a very important question, Josephine. I think the most honest answer is that I am an orphan, too. I can understand what it feels like to lose your mother and father. My older brother, younger sister, and I were orphaned when we were about your age. I know your hearts are aching and that you don't realize you're crying until the tears are running down your cheeks. I brought my Dulcimer so we can sing. Singing always helps me when my heart is breaking. Josephine listened and then hugged Miss Coffey. Pamela and Noran did the same. Betty watched and whispered, "Thank you," to Reverend Miller. Betty took the hat, coat, and Dulcimer from him and put them on the bed behind the room divider. Dr. Stevens had sent new sheets and blankets for Miss Coffey's bed. Reverend Miller explained, Dr. Stevens wants us to wash up the house and make sure we air out all the lingering tuberculosis danger. I hope you like washing as much as singing. Miss Coffey smiled at Reverend Miller. Do you like washing as much as singing? Reverend Miller grinned. Girls, you can see that Miss Coffey always tells the truth. In plain English, as my mother used to say. May I make us all some tea? Betty went with Reverend Miller to fill the kettle, stoke the fire, and the tea got started. So from Boone in the 1980s, we're beginning to develop characters and the Dulcimer. We also are going to, and again, I.G. Greer is the teacher and administrator that she lived with and knew throughout her adult life. Okay, more of those North Carolina roots. My Aunt Betty was the only girl of the sisters who never married. And she, when she died, she gave me a family record that had all of, she'd done the research. So I thought, well, this is interesting. I'll have to find out what's going on here. And as I developed, you could see that we had unmarked graves where the parents, the Dukes, were buried. And this is what it looked like at one time. Here's what it looks like later. It's been rebuilt. And Mother used to say, I remember when we were little, we went to a church that was fancier than Baptist. So Methodists are fancier than Baptists, we all know that. And so with that trip, and I started in June of 15 doing some research. So 2 of the girls go to nursing school. Mother goes to what was then Appalachian State Teachers College in North Carolina. So you can see the environment. You can see there she is with her second teaching assignment when she graduated was in Cherokee County. And you can see the Native children that she's with in that. Now, my mother lived with us after my father passed away, and she had dementia. One of the last things she did in her life was she put together a photo album with all of her favorite family pictures. So I'm looking through the photo album and I recognized the children, the aunts, the uncles, and in the middle of the photograph album is Eleanor Roosevelt, Mrs. Coffey, and IG, and Willie, he called him Willie, Ike, IG, Ike, and Willie is his wife, Greer. And I thought, this is very interesting. We apparently have family that Mother has not talked much about. I had met Mrs. Coffey. I'm starting, you can see There's so many questions, and a narrative is starting to begin in my head. So how do we talk about the real family history? Eleanor Roosevelt, these folks, you can see Mrs. Coffey has already appeared in the narrative. The Dulcimer has already appeared in the narrative. You can see the roots of that. I would like to read one piece, and the thing that's interesting is my mother was the second wife of George Duke. Okay, so there were older brothers. Robert Duke was one of them that they knew, but were much older and didn't live with the girl per se. So we're going to go here and find 3. And what 3 is taking us to the very end of the book. But there is a theme that comes in this book, and the theme is war. It is in again and again. There are many personal reasons for that. My father was in World War I. Mother worked in Washington when he was overseas. All of the aunts and uncles had World War II. We lived, when we were out of the war in 1946, the name of the community we lived in was Defense Heights. World War I was never talked about, but it was everywhere. My brother, who was a year younger than I am, was in Vietnam and came back and never was the same, as many happens to some veterans, and it certainly was my brother's story. So the whole idea of war, and how do peacekeepers, people in religion, think and talk about war? How do you love your neighbor and go to war? It's an eternal question. So that's a big part of the book. It also talks about how Eleanor Roosevelt's voice is throughout my mother's youth, early marriage. Eleanor is forming her thinking as much as anyone in the Thomasville Baptist Orphanage. Just as my mother did not talk about being an orphan, I realized that no one ever talked about World War II in our family or community. No one ever spoke of the war years, only the rebuilding of life and family after the war. I found myself returning to the relentless child who wanted to know all about the war years. What happened during the war that no one wanted to remember? Then I heard my mother's voice cautioning, "Be careful what you wish for." Davis Townsend School, Cherokee County, North Carolina, December 1941, mother's second teaching job. Josephine and her fellow teachers sat in front of the radio at their boarding house. As soon as the First Lady of the land, Eleanor Roosevelt, began to talk, a hush fell, and without speaking, everyone felt the change in the air. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am speaking to you tonight at a very serious moment in our history. The cabinet is convening and the leaders in Congress are meeting with the president. The State Department and Army and Navy officials have been with the president all afternoon. In fact, the Japanese ambassador was talking to the president at the very time that Japan's airships were bombing our citizens in Hawaii and the Philippines and sinking one of our transports loaded with lumber on its way to Hawaii. By tomorrow morning, the members of Congress will have a full report and be ready for action. In the meantime, we the people are already prepared for action. For months now, the knowledge that something of this kind might happen has been hanging over our heads, and it seemed impossible to believe, impossible to drop the everyday things of life and feel that there was only one thing which was important: preparation to meet an enemy no matter where he struck. That is all over now, and there is no more uncertainty. We know what we have to face. And she goes on. She says, to the young people of the nation, I must speak a word tonight. You are going to have a great opportunity. There will be high moments in which your strength and your ability will be tested. I have faith in you. I feel as though I was standing upon a rock, and that rock is my faith in my fellow citizens. Now we will go back to the program we had arranged. Eleanor Roosevelt, December 7th, 1941. As soon as the music began to play on the radio, there was a knock on the door. Josephine ran to open it. She was not surprised to see Mr. Howard, the school principal. I need your help in getting the word out that there will be no school tomorrow. Here are the list of families that have phones. If you can, call them. I will work with their men with cars to reach the families without phones. We will meet at the school tomorrow morning at 10. This should give us enough time to plan and be ready for the president's message. I will bring the radio. I am sure that tomorrow will change all our lives. Thank you, Miss Duke. Josephine got in touch. They all arrive, and we hear the president, vice president, and those assembled listen to FDR. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces in the Sea of Japan. In the text, we talk about Josephine looking at a picture of her stepbrother, Robert Duke, who is stationed in Pearl Harbor on the USS Arizona. The attack on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American forces, FDR went on. Josephine looked at the photo and wondered how she could get in touch with Irene, Robert's wife. The president's voice did not soothe her. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures for our defense always will behold the nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. As the speech ends, there is a thunderous applause coming from the radio and the people gathered in the room. But Josephine could not move. She knew in her heart that Robert Duke was dead. So, is life fair? Anybody here think it's fair? I don't think so, no. Do you keep on living? Do you keep on giving? Do you keep on loving? And so now we're going to leave the family, the singing, and we have talked about the merging of Eleanor Roosevelt with the family chronology, the loss of the stepbrother at Pearl Harbor. And now we are going to find Dr. Kessler. Where I found Kessler. Kessler is the fictionalized name in the book. Dr. Kessler is the real person. There is a magnificent history of the Thomasville Baptist Orphanage called Love in Action. Doesn't that say it all? What does love in action look like if you're working with orphans? We know what it doesn't look like. One of the funny stories is my mother, again, in the dementia years, last years of her life, was listening to Annie. And it's tomorrow, I love you, tomorrow, you're only a day away. So we're singing that. And my mother starts to laugh hysterically. I said, Mother, what's funny? She says, that's so silly. Don't they know they have today? That pretty much said it for me. As I did this, I loved the Thomasville Baptist Orphanage, and I thought, maybe I'll keep the real names, the real people. And I was talking to a friend who worked for the Boston Globe for 40 years. She was in a little writing group I was in. And I said, do you think I should take this manuscript and go to the Thomasville Baptist Orphanage? She said, sure, and I'll tell you what's going to happen. I said, what's going to happen? She said, they'll have a committee. They'll put it on a desk for 2 years, and then they'll tell you no. I said, okay, well, we'll skip that. We'll call it the Appalachian Jackson Orphanage and go forward in the fictionalized narrative of Mother's life. What you need to know is that Dr. Kessler was not fiction, and he was a luminary in not only North Carolina, but in the nation. As you can see here, and again, I'm reading from the slide, as you read from the slide, Kessler attained national standing in child care circles. He participated in White House conferences concerning child care policies and was in wide demand as a speaker on child welfare topics. This is the head, the superintendent of the orphanage, the mother and her sisters are at. He was a trustee at Wake Forest College, Meredith College, the Baptist Hospital at Winston-Salem, and the Child Welfare League of America. In 1922, during Kessler's administration, the Mills Home was added grade 11, putting it among the high schools with the most advanced instruction in North Carolina at that time. During the Kessler era, the percentage of orphanage graduates who attended college became much higher than that of the general population. Has anybody ever heard of this orphanage before? No. Again, here's a photo of the first White House Conference on Children and Youth. We see Eleanor Roosevelt seated with the group. Now, I think I went one too many. Can we back up? It's the one that's with Asheville Home. Oh, we're back. We're going forward. Back. There we go. Okay. Now, as the storyteller in me started, there was another story that Mother told and her younger sister told. It was not a long story. It went like this. When our parents died, some rich people in Asheville wanted to adopt myself and my little sister, Nora Ann. And I could not lose my father, my mother, and my 2 sisters. So when those rich people took us to North Carolina, to Asheville, I had to pitch a fit until they brought me to the orphanage to be with my sisters. I asked my cousins, Nora Ann's children, what Nora Ann said. Nora Ann only said, we had to be very, very rude. This is the story I have to work with. So my first question is, what's the connection? I mean, how does a rich person find anybody in dirt poor Warren, North Carolina? That makes no sense. How does that happen? So I'm thinking, okay, well, we know from Aunt Betty's research that there is a graveyard. We do know if there's a graveyard, there's probably a minister involved. Okay. So we have a minister. Let's see. So we have a minister. Where would he have gone to college where you could have met somebody who was rich in North Carolina? And why would that rich person even care about these little girls? So I started reading, and remember Dr. Kessler is on the board at Wake Forest. Wake Forest has a fascinating history. And when I started researching that, what I realized is that people in medicine and people in theology, there was an undergraduate program there where the best and the brightest would meet and could get to know each other, form friendships. And I think most of us who have college friendships know they last a long time. And so I began to create a minister and his friends, Dr. Stevens, and to come up with a way that Dr. Stevens could have met the girls. Dr. Stevens, of course, is studying tuberculosis research in Asheville. I'd like you to, but another part of what I deal with in this book is how do you have people who, as my mother when she wrote her little, who she was, she had a manifesto, creed, and she said, I admire people who live the Word of God as told in the Bible, and I hate the people who just thump that Bible. Okay, pretty strong. So we're going to read about Dr. Stevens and his friend, Reverend Miller and Dr. Stevens in theology class. Now, Josephine is gone out with Miss Coffee, and she's come back in. When Josephine and Miss Coffee entered the cabin, they were surprised to hear the sound of laughter. Mrs. Stevens looked at Miss Coffee, saying, these boys can't seem to get together without telling us stories of their college days. Makes me glad to think that I will only be raising girls. Mrs. Stevens had set out lemonade and homemade oatmeal raisin cookies on fancy little china plates. The Stevensons are the rich people. They are now with Josephine and her sisters in their home. She laughed when Dr. Stevens and Reverend Miller told their stories. Miss Coffee, who is the fiance of Reverend Miller, was the only one who kept looking at Josephine with concern. Josephine has already found her iron pants and has a plan. We're back to the boys. Did I ever tell you the one about Dr. Stevens taking a New Testament class with me? Asked Reverend Miller. I had to promise him a meal if he took the class. Matt Stevens was the only student who ever made the head of our theology department, Professor Taylor, laugh. When our men of the cloth drifted into platitudes, Matt was there to break their pious spell. His words stay with me to this day. Ah, faith in action. There's the rub. Really welcoming the stranger who wants to eat your food and marry your daughter? Your relatives are furious. Your congregation is ready to stone you. Doing what Jesus says is gonna make them mad as Hades. Matt's was a new voice in our class for sure. My favorite class began when Dr. Taylor quoted the Gospel of Matthew 26:11. For ye have the poor always with you. He asked about the church's duty to the poor. Some of our classmates proposed that we did not really need to worry too much about the poor. We just needed to concentrate on Jesus. Matt fired back. I am sure if Jesus were here today, he would wonder at your logic. He would certainly disagree with your conclusions. I think poor really does mean poor. Your assurances that we probably won't have to help them until the end of time are just wrong. Reverend Miller looked at his friend with both love and amusement. Matt always ended his challenging remarks with a dramatic flourish of his hand and a nod toward our professor. Dr. Taylor would roar with laughter, a laugh that immediately silenced any student under Matt's attack. As Reverend Miller finished his story, Dr. Stevens looked at the group, gave a dramatic hand flourish, and everyone laughed. So you're starting to see these two men, one a minister in rural Warren, North Carolina, his friend, who is a rich family, white rich family, are going to take the two little girls, and only Miss Coffee has an inkling that things are not going to go well when we get to Asheville. Okay. So again, what is real and what is not real? You can see there, and we've talked about it. You know that Mother and her sister's names are real. You know that when you look at the book, there are portions that begin like the Carroll County one. We're in Carroll County in 1986. So what I did was the book takes about a year's narrative. And someone said to me, but you have to keep writing until we know what happened to all four of the girls. I said, that will be 20 books. I'm not writing 20 books. And I was talking to a writing editor, and she said, why don't you just put the adult Josephine's voice in there, and then she can say what I'm doing now, so we know. And then I thought, oh, well, Mother likes to talk to me. I'll just put my own voice in here. So basically, you have the perspective. You know what's going on in these voices. So what is true is if you read anything attributed to Josephine or Elaine, that I know is true. Everything else, and you know that there is an exemplary orphanage called the Thomasville Baptist Orphanage. You know the names of these families, and you know that the themes will always be the themes which are help. One of the things I did, and it was heartbreaking in this, I thought, I wonder, so in 2020, I think, I did research on what is rural healthcare in Warren County, North Carolina. If COVID hits, is the doctor coming to see you? What do you think? No. The percentage of doctors to population of 100,000 can't even compare to Asheville or other places. So rural healthcare is not getting better. And so we start looking at these themes as we develop narrative, and each of the characters will bring a theme. Okay, so we've talked about Reverend Miller. We've talked about Miss Coffee. We've talked about Miss Faircloth. Now, Mr. Harris is a librarian. Why would I care about a librarian? And so what happened was, and this was the other fact Mother told me. She said, at the school, there was a librarian named Mr. Harris. He had a little round tummy, little round glasses, and he would tell you stories. And I loved him, loved him. So Mr. Harris became where my knowledge that I share with so many of you in this room on what does a library do, where are the books, et cetera, et cetera. What I adored about this is that I got to create some friends that, and what did the friends do? One is a mother, has lost her mother, who was a famous children's book illustrator. You can make that up like you want. And then another boy who was rich, but because he was friends, got to be friends when their parents were dying of tuberculosis, he went to the orphanage with Virginia. So Walter, Virginia, they became the Three Pencilteers. And so the how do children write stories? How do you write stories? How do you put books in the library? All began. Now, the use of story. Oh, and this is going to be, we're going to zip through this, but I have to read you one little story. Story is used to forewarn, to heal, to understand, to amuse. We're going to tell you the story of Brother Possum. Any folklorists know that there is a real story about Brother Possum. This is the story in the book. As Nora Ann and Josephine snuggled in bed, Josephine decided to do a let's go to sleep version of Brother Possum. She would tell an abbreviated story, tickle Nora Ann, who played Brother Possum, and they would go to sleep. She began her story. Brother Possum loves peace. Possum and Raccoon were walking along and having a nice little confab. Suddenly along comes Bad Dog, who is just raring for a fight. Are you with me, Possum? Asked Raccoon, just as Bad Dog attacked. As soon as dog jumped possum, possum fell on the ground like he was dead. Lay there as stiff as a board and didn't wiggle a finger or a nose. Raccoon was a great fighter, and soon dog knew he was beat. As soon as Raccoon let loose, that dog ran away with his tail between his legs. No more fighting. Raccoon looked at Possum just lying there, stiff on the ground, turned up his nose, and walked on home. Later that week, when Raccoon and Possum met on the road, Possum asked if Raccoon wanted to come for some dinner. Raccoon said he didn't have dinner with no cowards. He said he would not be friends with anyone who wouldn't join him in a fight. I don't need anybody with me that just lays down and plays dead at the first sign of trouble, he snarled. Then Possum began to laugh. You thought I was scared? Not so, my friend. I could have taken that dog down all by myself. I knew I could as well. But before I could begin to fight, that old dog sniffed my ribs and all my tickle bones jumped. I just froze up with all that tickling on my ribs. Looked like I was dead, but I was just tickled to death for a little while. Raccoon looked at his friend, raised up an eyebrow. Possum said, just know that if you want someone with you, it will have to be in a fight with no tickling allowed. The end. Josephine giggled, and now you know what comes next, Nora Ann. I'm ticklish. She started to tickle Nora Ann, who stiffened up, closed her eyes, and held her breath. She was playing dead, just like Possum, Josephine realized. Nora Ann, you're so smart. You're acting out the story. You are Possum for sure. Nora Ann opened her eyes. I'm not Possum. I'm Mother. I'm only playing dead. I will wake up and get my girls so we can go home, sighed Nora Ann as she stiffened up and shut her eyes. Josephine froze and her eyes filled with tears. She had no words to explain that life was not like a story and that their mother was not like Possum and just playing dead. Nora Ann, she whispered, do you really think Mother is alive? Nora Ann kept her eyes closed and lay stiff. Nora Ann, she said again. A minute passed as Nora Ann held her breath and didn't move. Finally, Nora Ann opened one eye. What? She said. Do you really think Mother is still alive? Josephine repeated. Maybe, said Nora Ann, squinting. Maybe. I wish I might have my mother dear tonight. Josephine snuggled closer until she felt Nora Ann relax and snuggle back. You know what Daddy always said about wishes, she said. A moment later, they said in unison, if wishes were horses, beggars would ride. Nora Ann sighed, put her arms around her big sister. We don't have our mother, but we have each other, Josephine whispered. So the story is throughout here, and we're going to so the use of story, you can see this. You can see research. Every time I wrote something, it took 7 years to do this. What were they wearing? How did they get the news? How do you keep up with Eleanor Roosevelt? How is rural healthcare changing? Where would a doctor go after Asheville? Iron Pants wins. They reunite her with her sisters. What happens to the Stevensons? The pandemic of 1918. This was breathtaking. You read other than the word mask, there we are. There was a story where they used story to convince Mrs. Stevens that she has to let them go back to the orphanage about robins. We took a train ride, race. Okay, Thomasville Baptist. There's a Baptist orphanage, there's an orphanage for colored, and there's an orphanage for feeble-minded. It is not perfect, in the early 1900s in orphanages. That's the kind of segregation, the racism that's going on. And yet we're talking about my mother with Eleanor Roosevelt and everything she said. There is a new South. When she does her manifesto, she said, I am from the South, but I am not defined by that. And she talks about that. We talk about if you're taking a train ride, who's there, who's working, what's going on, what are they reading? I have to build a library. Hey, was that fun? Okay. And the thing we all know as we do research is I can find the text in any library online, the whole text with illustrations for any book I want to find out if Mr. Harris and the kids choose to go there. When we're hiding curls, there's a story in there where they cut the girl's hair. You know, this little cover shows you the bowl cut. Who in this room has ever had a bowl cut? That's where the bowl goes and the scissors go. I'm the only one. You had a bowl cut, right? Okay, so you got a bowl cut. So when they did that to one of the pencilteers, Walter is going to save the red curls. He's going to put them in a, so I have to find out what box would he be, what it would look like, yada, yada, yada. You get an idea of the endless research that you're doing with this. What about an automobile? They're going to go insert the rural poor. It's not a horse and buggy. So we have the roamer from Kalamazoo, Michigan. We have, what we found out was Pamela had mental health issues. You can find that in her character. And where I'm thinking, where is solace for Pamela? And what surprised me was in the 1920s, this orphanage had a swimming pool. So I found Annette Kellerman, she became important. When Reverend Kessler is talking about the war, he refers to Tar Heels. So I thought, I've heard Tar Heels, I don't know anything. There are three versions of how that phrase came. How do we feel about war? Now, when I started this book, I've written it 3 times. Isn't that fun? The first time was going to be a Harry Potter, and it was in the first person. It was a school story. As I did more research and more thinking, I'm thinking this is not a school story. This is a story for some school students all the way through 100. So then I thought, well, I'll make Iron Pants a character, like the stage manager in our town. So Iron Pants came in like blah, 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 and then you read the story. That wasn't working. And then finally, we added third-person voice, told the story chronologically, and then added Josephine and Elaine. Now, here we are, history repeating ourselves. As you listen to Eleanor Roosevelt, wouldn't you like to listen to her tonight on the television? I would. Pandemic, oral health care. Hope that you will come to me from war. Look at all the people that are saying goodbye. The use of story and where we all connect with Iron Pants. We're going to stop. We're going to do a little question and answer. Yes.
We have one question from online. This is from Mary Lou. She asks, have you been back to North Carolina for more research after your trip with your mother?
No. And hi, Mary Lou, I adore you. These are the family of 4 girls that were our babysitters. So every time the oldest one discovered boys, there was a sister waiting. Mary Lou was our second babysitter. Yay. I have not gone back. And the reason I have not gone back is, as I did my online research, what I saw was something that didn't look anything like, you know, as Mother said, they moved the town, you know, they moved the orphanage. So I haven't been back. It is something we're going to do. You know, I think in a weird way, Wake Forest is an interesting place to begin this. Not the orphanage per se, because it was so much fiction. So Mary Lou, no, I have not been back. I plan to go back. And I just have to come up with, is it Wake Forest I start with? How do I go back? But what I found even online is they did move the orphanage, as Mother said, and they did move a lot of what the story talks about. So, great, thanks. Any other questions? No, you're all good? Yes,
We do have one more online
good.
from Mary Lou. She wants to know about your puppet making.
My,
How do you make the wonderful puppets you make, she asked.
oh, the puppets, okay. Well, Susie was there the moment that I don't make puppet, I make puppet shows in puppets. But Susie and I, it didn't cost anything for us to do our first puppet show, did it?
No,
No,
we
it
just,
didn't.
we just found things.
We just found a bunch of puppets.
We
and
made them with, remember with nylons and pantyhose? I
Yes,
think she's
yes.
probably thinking about that. And Louise Suchinich
Yes,
and had large characters made like that and very real looking. And we just adapted that to make very inexpensive puppets. So
and
that may be the one that we can say we really did just make those as we needed them.
made them as we needed them. And in the first puppet show we did was a holiday one, was about a poor little tree in the forest that everyone passed by and ridiculed. It was misshapen, and who would ever want a tree that ugly? And then Christmas Eve, the animals came and were kind and loving to the tree and decorated the tree that, of course, when the star came out, everything exploded in beauty at this little tree. There was a bit character in that show, a little yellow duck, who only came in with a group of animals to say, let's decorate the tree. This little duck comes on, looks at the audience and says, decorate, 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 woohoo! I don't know. And so the duck was born. The worst moment I had in Carroll County Storytime history is we're in the auditorium in the new library, which is, it still is the new library, but it's, bigger and better, keeps getting that way all the time. And so I have the duck with me, and we're talking about the new baby. So the duck's in his little puppet stage, and we have the bear on my lap with a little pacifier around his neck. And we're talking about how we just need to take care of that new baby and all our attention's on that new baby. And so the duck says, Mrs. Myers, get that bear off your lap. I said, oh, no, I can't. He's a baby. He needs all my attention. Blah, blah, blah. We just story about the new baby. The duck comes back up. Mrs. Myers, get that. Hi, Mike. Get that duck off your lap. I said, no, I can't, new baby, blah, blah, another story. Then, and as I taught storytelling, I said, be careful of your puppet. It is the pathway for your id when you will least expect it. So the duck comes out. There are 100 mothers and small children in this room. And I hear the duck say, I said, get that damn bear off your lap. A little boy raises his hand. This is why we will always work with children. And he says, Mrs. Myers, Duckie needs a nap. Yes, he does. His little sister says, here, he can have my blankie. And up and down he goes. I told that story frequently, and when I retired in Arizona, the name of my retirement party was What the Duck. So, yes, puppets are always fun, but be careful. Any other, yes?
We have someone asking about the cover of the book.
Oh, thank you. The cover. So there, and I don't think you can see it. When you went to the Thomasville Baptist Orphanage, what would happen is you would get a bowl cut. They would put a fancy dress on you, and they would take your picture. They would take the dress away from you. You would keep your bowl cut, and life went on. when I was working with the publisher, they said, do you have any ideas for the cover? And I sent pictures of my mother in Nora Ann with a bowl haircut and the dress. I said, this is what Iron Pants look like for the majority of the time she was in the orphanage in the scope of this book. And so I got a sketch of this, just a pencil sketch. And they said, if you like that, the artist will go forward and complete the color and complete the illustration. And I looked at the sketch and I went in my office where I had a portrait that was done of my mother by a neighbor who was teaching portraiture. She was in her late 60s. And he said, Josephine, if you sit while I teach the class, I will give you the portrait. I have the portrait because my father said, I don't like it. It doesn't look like you. And my mother said, you have to have it because it's how I feel inside. Everyone I've shown, I've put this sketch up to that portrait and it brings tears to your eye. It's how my mother feels inside. The artist never, ever saw this. What the artist did do, because of the text of the script, is put her writing, put books under her arm, which is the theme of it. When I got the first illustration back, it's this illustration with very dark lines under the eyes, dark lines here, kind of an angry look. And I thought, okay, I've worked with publishing and publishers, I know, but if I say to the illustrator, I don't like it because it looks angry, that probably that book is going to sit on somebody's shelf for 2 years because I pissed off the illustrator. But I had to say it. So within 3 weeks, I get this back. So it was done from a portrait. It does not look like mother. The reason they did sepia was, and it took me about 3 weeks to figure this out, what color is iron? You know? So that's how the cover came to be.
You helped me, I'm sorry.
Yes.
You helped me get to a point in figuring out how to frame a book that I'm working on right now. And talking about how you did it, because I'm working on it's a similar theme set in Illinois. Farming community starts in the 1880s. And I was feeling like I want to tell the story of those people, the big story, but it's really one particular person that it's mostly about. It's a relative. And I think to start with her and put some, the fictional and the real, mixing it, I like that.
Well, and it's very interesting. One of the most important moments in this process for me is, he's gone. Anyway, the guy who has a name, which we all know and love, his name is blah, blah, Anthony Doerr, who wrote the one I love the most, Pulitzer for All the Light We Cannot See. He was speaking in Syracuse, near where we live, and he said, one of the most important things I learned about writing a book, and I'm hanging on every word, he said, you can write the end of the story anytime you want. So I thought about that and I thought, okay, when does the story end? I thought it is 1 year in time. It starts when the mother dies and it ends 1 year later. In a weird way, that's extremely liberating. The story continues with the other voices. So thank you very much. That's the nicest compliment, because what I hope is that as this is a story that hadn't been told, I want to make sure everybody who has a story tells it. Yes.
I just wanted to ask, you've done a lot of research, took time, and delved into a lot of different things. Is there an aha that you came away from that, or your biggest surprise through your research, whether it was kind of big picture or your family?
I would say the biggest aha, the thing that shaped so much of the story, was the mystery of how do the rich people in Asheville So as I started looking at Wake Forest, I started looking at medical education. What I saw is in that part of North Carolina, interracial schools, scholars working with Johns Hopkins. So my big surprise was here you are in rural North Carolina in the beginning of the 20th century, and you're seeing best practices, not only in this orphanage, but in universities and so forth. So my big aha was it didn't just happen at the orphanage. There were connections like the Greers and the Coffees that were made even in small community. So that was it. As I started looking at that, I thought, because honestly, you did not make any, my mother was completely like Eleanor Roosevelt and all smart people, intolerant of any racism. It didn't happen, okay? It didn't. And where did she get that? You know, so when I started doing the history, but it was particularly on the universities, where would the ministers and the doctors meet? What would they be talking about? Who would be the people? And again, the other big aha is Kessler going to the White House conference. So I thought, oh my gosh, they're all PhDs at this place. It's the middle of nowhere, really. Yeah. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
So as the librarian always says, did that answer your question?
Completely.
Yeah, completely answer your question. Any other thoughts, comments? Thank you. It's coming home for both my husband and myself. It's lovely to be here. And we'll be listening to your book soon.
Okay.
Iron Pens, if you have a copy and you want me to sign it, I would love to do it. You can buy it in a variety of places, but we really appreciate you checking out the library. So,